So for today's explainer, we're doing something a little different. Our source material isn't some dense research paper or a breaking news article. Nope, it's an 8th grade history test. That's right, we're going to piece together the epic story of the founding of the United States using nothing but the clues and questions from a middle school exam. So let's dive in and see what story this thing is trying to tell us. Yeah, I know. It sounds a little weird, right? But think about it. These tests are designed to hit the absolute most crucial points of a story. They're kind of like a blueprint of the essential narrative. So what can these questions really reveal about the birth of a nation? Well, as it turns out, they tell a surprisingly compelling story of rebellion, chaos, and brilliant, brilliant compromise. You know, every great story starts with a problem. And for the American colonies, that problem was the British crown. It really started heating up with taxes. First came the Sugar Act in '64, then the Stamp Act a year later. Now, from the British perspective, hey, they were just paying for the defense of the colonies. But for the colonists, no way. This was taxation without representation, and that was a huge deal. The anger just simmered and simmered until it finally boiled over in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party, which set them on a direct path to that final break in 1776. But here's the thing. This was never just about money. It was about ideas. You gotta remember, the colonists were totally immersed in the philosophy of the Enlightenment, especially the work of John Locke. And his core idea, which the test makes sure to highlight, is this powerful concept. People have natural rights that no king, no government can ever take away. This idea became the intellectual fuel for the entire revolution. It turned a simple tax dispute into a full-blown fight for freedom itself. So, you're facing a king you feel has trampled all over your rights. What do? Well, the colonists chose a pretty radical solution, basically a national divorce. And that brings us right to the Declaration of Independence. The test really focuses on its core promise, what it calls unalienable rights. I mean, these are concepts so big, so fundamental that they can't be given away or taken from you. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was the moral bedrock for their entire argument. And if unalienable rights were the why behind the revolution, then the grievances were the what. The Declaration wasn't just some high-minded philosophical essay. It was literally a breakup letter, listing every single thing the king had done wrong. And the test makes it clear. He ignored their laws. He stopped their own governors from getting things done. Basically, he treated them like subjects, not citizens. This list was their public, official case for why they had to leave. Well, you write a breakup letter like that, there are going to be consequences. The result, of course, was the Revolutionary War. After years of fighting, the test points us to the final moments. The British surrender at Yorktown, which led straight to the Treaty of Paris. The colonists had actually won. They were free. But in solving the king problem, they'd created a brand new, massive one. Okay, we're free. Now what? How in the world do you govern yourselves? Their first shot at an answer was the Articles of Confederation. And just by looking at what it could and couldn't do, you can just feel how terrified they were of creating a new king. The central government, sure, it could declare war and make treaties, but that was about it. It couldn't tax, couldn't raise an army, and there was no president or national court system. All the real power stayed with the states. It was weak on purpose, by design. And the result? You guessed it, total chaos. In trying so hard to avoid a new king, they'd created a government that couldn't actually govern. It was a classic overcorrection, right? They swung the pendulum from a government that was way too strong to one that was just way, way too weak to get anything done. So what does that chaos actually look like on the ground? Well, the test points us to the perfect example. Since the government couldn't tax, it couldn't pay its war debts, the economy went into a tailspin. And in Massachusetts, you had indebted farmers, a lot of them war veterans, who rose up in what's called Shays' Rebellion. They literally shut down the courts to stop their farms from being foreclosed on. And the national government, it was completely powerless to do anything about it. And this right here is the moment the test really zeroes in on. Shays' Rebellion was the ultimate wake-up call. It was the shock to the system that made everyone, especially the nation's leaders, go, okay, this isn't working. They realized that liberty couldn't survive in total chaos. They needed a government with just enough power to keep order, but not so much that it would crush their rights. It was time for a do-over. And that do-over was the Constitutional Convention. And boy, was it a battle of ideas. You basically had two big camps emerge, which would become America's first political parties. In one corner, you have the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton. They wanted a strong central government, a national bank, things to help business and commerce. Think city folk, merchants, the wealthy. In the other corner, you have the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. They were terrified of a strong government and were all about states' rights and protecting the small rural farmer. So how on earth do you bring these two totally opposite views together? The answer, in one word, was compromise. The test points out two huge ones. First, the Great Compromise, which settled the fight between big and small states. They created a two-house legislature, a house based on population, and a Senate where every state was equal. And then there's the really tough one, the Three-Fifths Compromise. It was this dark, terrible bargain over how to count enslaved people for both representation and for taxes. But even with these big compromises, a lot of people were still not on board. These critics were called the Anti-Federalists, and they were still really afraid this new government was just too powerful. They had one demand that was an absolute deal breaker, and it's a key point on the test. They wanted a Bill of Rights. They needed a clear, written guarantee that would protect individual freedoms from this new federal government they were creating. And the final result, the Constitution, is this masterpiece of political engineering. It's built on these core principles you see here. Okay, so the whole thing starts with the idea that the people rule, period. But to make sure that power is never abused, it's constantly split up. First between the national and state governments, and then again into three separate branches at the federal level. And to top it off, each of those branches can check the power of the other two. It's this really clever system, designed to be strong enough to actually work, but with all these built-in guardrails to make sure no one part ever becomes a new king. All right, so the new nation is up and running. Now what? How does it deal with the rest of the world? The test points us straight to George Washington's farewell address. And his advice was basically, look, trade with everybody, be friendly, but do not get tangled up in their political drama. His vision was for a neutral America, one that could stay free from all the constant fighting in Europe. But you know how it is. That idea of staying out of it didn't last forever. As the young country got more confident, the vision started to shift. Just a couple of decades later, in 1823, President James Monroe issued what we now call the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, just listen to the change in tone here. America isn't just avoiding foreign problems anymore. It's now actively drawing a line in the sand and telling Europe, this whole hemisphere, it's our backyard. Stay out. Talk about a change in attitude. So there you have it, the birth of an entire nation, all pieced together from the clues in an 8th grade history test. From a tax revolt that was fueled by big ideas, to a first government that was a total failure, to this series of incredible and incredibly difficult compromises that built a republic. But it leaves us with one last big thought. The founders built this incredible machine for self-government. They created the rulebook, but they couldn't possibly predict who the players would be down the line. And that leaves us with the real question, right? How would all the generations to come, how would we use, challenge, and maybe even change the very system they designed?